I know we're now here for our esteemed keynote speech, so just as a reminder, this keynote presentation will be recorded so that other AASA members who aren't here at the conference can watch it later if they choose to. And as a result, if you have any questions or comments at the end of the presentation, you'll need to make your way down and talk into one of these microphones just so that will be recorded, so the person watching it later doesn't just have blank for a minute of silence. So please just make your way down as we did yesterday if you have a question or comment. All right, thank you. Now I will introduce you to our keynote presenter for today. Danny Celermajer is here today. Danny is the Deputy Director of the Sydney Environment Institute and the lead of the Multi-Species Justice Project at the University of Sydney. Over the last decade, she has turned her attention from uniquely intra-human injustice and human rights to injustices and violence against the more than human world and their intersection with injustice against particular groups of humans. Through the experience of living through the Black Summer bushfires as part of a multi-species community, Danny began writing about a new crime of our age, omnicide. Her creative non-fiction book, Summertime, Reflections on a Vanishing Future, in 2021, was written in recognition of the critical urgency of conveying the complex conceptual recognition of the multi-species harms of climate catastrophe. Danny's latest book, co-authored with other members of the Multi-Species Justice Collective, is called Institutionalising Multi-Species Justice, and it came out this year. So Danny today is going to share with us her thoughts and understandings around the topic, researching our way through the Eremocene, how a few other animals taught me about relational, embodied ways of knowing. So please join me in welcoming Danny Celermajer. Thank you.
I tend to be a little hopeless with changing the slides, so hopefully I can manage that. Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to all of the AASA committee for giving me this real privilege to speak to this group. It's a group of scholars and artists who I really treasure as the human part of my multi-species community. I also want to pay my respects to the traditional owners of these lands and any First Nations people who are here, and to acknowledge that I live, work and play on the lands of the Dharawal people of the Yuin Nation, and really am enormously grateful for the care for country that enables me to do the work in our community to live a thriving life. Before I jump into my presentation, I wanted to say a few words about the stories and the images that I'm going to share. They are very intimate stories, sometimes about death of the animals other than humans who I live with. And I was reflecting yesterday on issues of consent, and obviously consent for doing research, sharing the stories and images of non-human others is a complex business, and I hope that the relationships of reciprocity that we have formed over the last years of living together count as a type of consent, but I also share these stories and images in a trusted community, so I know that you will hold them as such. So in early 2016, not long after we had moved to a rainforest in southeast New South Wales, I received an email from someone I didn't know. Our embryonic multi-species community had found its way onto the animal rescue grapevine, and so I was increasingly receiving these types of emails. 2 pigs, Jimmy and Katie, needed a home. At the violent beginning of their lives, animal activists had scooped them up, tiny and discarded, as wastage, and from there Marilyn had given them safe passage into their lives. But now, 4 years later, Marilyn was finally leaving a marriage that made no room for her animal relationships. And with this, her access to land where Jimmy and Katie could live was also foreclosed. We'd never lived with pigs, and we knew nothing about them, but we had land and resources and, most important, curiosity about their worlds. So we said yes, and one morning in March, Marilyn drove up in her float through the front gate. She got out, opened the back, and walked down through the paddock, past the donkeys, Jimmy and Katie, huge and pink, following behind. I feel a great deal of shame about what happened next, so it's difficult for me to share publicly, but I tell this part of the story because it serves as an index for how much Jimmy and Katie and everybody else taught me in the ensuing 10 years. In our tremendous ignorance and thinking that we needed to protect Jimmy and Katie from running away, we left in place the electrified wire fence that was around their new area. After they walked through the gate, Jimmy, disoriented, ran into the electrified wire, and his confusion turned to terror. Thankfully, there was someone nearby who he could trust, so he ran all 300 kilograms of him and lay down with Marilyn. His terror moving directly into my body, I scrambled around and pulled down the electrified wire. Unsurprisingly, once Jimmy and Katie understood where this was a place where they were safe to eat and sleep, to rest and play, they felt no desire to leave. After all, it was their home. And as they taught us that trust could be reciprocal, most of the fences came down altogether. Jimmy, in particular, as combined meteorologist, architect and engineer, designed and constructed a series of places etched into the bush where he could find repose. Each was perfectly adapted to different seasons and kinds of weather, attuned to where the light fell, so he could sense particular breezes and could listen to the lyrebirds and the river. Those of you who read some of what I wrote during and in the immediate aftermath of the Black Summer fires know something of the next years of their lives, how deeply they became part of the community, sinking into the land and our shared lives, and about the apocalypse that beset them and Katie's singular death amidst the unfolding omnicide. And then Jimmy's grief and trauma when he survived both the fire and Katie's death, and some of what he taught me during those weeks about the complexity of other animals' emotions and sense-making, about navigating loss, that honouring relationships with other animals means not simply stepping back so they can make decisions about how they live, but sometimes about whether they want to live at all. In late January 2020, when Jimmy decided to live, I thought he had taught me the death lesson. But then 21 months later, he became gravely ill. Late one September afternoon, as the light was fading, I went over to let the horses out after dinner, and uncharacteristically, Jimmy wandered over. He was normally in bed by dusk, but there he was in an unusual place at an unexpected hour, agitated and confused. The next morning, he stopped eating and drinking, and over the ensuing days, he became increasingly weak. The vet suggested a range of digestive and pain medications, but suspected something far more malign from the beginning. I spent every day sitting with him down in one of the soft places in his world, giving him fluids through a syringe. Penny, who had come to live with us after Katie's death, just off to the side. At night, I lay in their house until he fell asleep and went back to the human house, falling into my own sleep of fear that he would be gone in the morning. Eventually, the vet told us that the only possible way to keep him alive was to take him to an animal hospital 3 hours away. So we called Marilyn back and borrowed a float and organised to drive him north. When we backed the float into his world and lowered the tailgate, he didn't want to get in. But focused as I was on his survival, I coaxed him to walk in with me. When I eventually managed to get him in, closed the back, told Marilyn that we were ready to go and stayed in the back with him to ride the way to Sydney. As I settled by his side, the urgency that had catapulted me through time receded, and I was finally able to take him in. I told Marilyn, he looked at me and communicated with the utmost astonishing clarity. I don't want to go. This is my world, and you can't take me out of my world and think that you are saving me. The me that you are removing is not the me I am for myself. This is my world, not an individual body abstracted from it. Let me stay in my world. Unlike the first communication where Jimmy had to run around and scream in terror for me to work out what he needed, this one was still and silent, but no less vivid. During the intervening 7 years of daily life together, he had taught me not only to attend, but that he was there with all of his knowledge, his understanding, and his orientation to his own life. That attending to him was not only an ethical obligation, but a practice that opened out into the astonishing possibility of ethical relationship across difference. It's a strange thing how we actually come to really know, including coming to recognise the layers and nests of knowing. I'd spent years reading and writing about entanglement, critiquing ideas of the bounded individual, and even theorised multi-species justice as a way of insisting that beings always and only flourish as part of flourishing relationships. But it was only when Jimmy told me his body to my body, both of us steeped in the at-stakeness of life and death, in an encounter saturated with love and loss, it was only then that I really understood that he did not end at the edge of his body. His life as he lived it was a life of his world. And so we opened the float, he walked back out into his world, lived there for a few more days, and then Jimmy died. Given that we are at an academic conference, you might well be wondering what a keynote speaker is doing telling stories about pigs. So I'm going to slip for a few moments into a more formal scholarly voice to draw on its authority to explain why I think the habits that we have come to acquire from the modernist academy so poorly serve the ethical impulses that I think motivate us to become animal scholars, and why stories that evoke particular and embodied encounters with other animals can thread the different dimensions of knowledge in ways that weave us into an ethics of infinite diversity and singular commitment. Just as Jimmy taught me that he was of his world, so too we are always perceiving, thinking, researching, and theorising from somewhere. Now that's of course not a new thought. As feminist, post-structuralist, critical race, Indigenous and queer theorists have taught us, our business, the business of knowing and making meaning, is always situated and saturated with situation. In place of an epistemology that finds its highest expression in metaphysics, that place that is no place and time that is no time, this more modest epistemology acknowledges that knowledge is always refracted through material and cultural conditions, relations of power, and the larger imaginaries that condition the scope of what can be known and how we know it. Recognising the situated nature of knowledge helps us to contextualise others' knowledge claims and to hold ours more lightly with appropriate humility. Of late, though, I've been thinking about the specifically ethical implications of taking into account the character of the world, both as the world that conditions what we can know and how we try and go about knowing, and the world beyond which we hope our research might take us. In other words, I've been thinking about how the character of our age shapes what can show up and how, and more importantly, how the character of our age defines the ethical stakes of our work. Now, I realise that's a dense thought. I'm going to come back and unpack it. First, though, I want to ponder the question, what is the character of our age? Now, that's a dangerously broad question, and even asking it, I could be accused of committing the sin of hypostatizing the very universal we that critical theories I've just outlined expose as a ruse of domination. Nevertheless, I think there are meaningful ways of responding to it, and responses that are sensitive to issues of power and difference. And given the extremity of the historical moment, it's one with which I feel compelled to grapple. There have been many attempts to name this age, the most famous being the Anthropocene, but a host of others are on offer: the Capitalocene, the Plantationocene, the Catholicene, the Manthropocene, the Plasticene, the Pyrocene, and cheekily, the Neologism scene. Their proliferation speaks to the significant contestation over how exactly to characterise what is it about the now that breaks so radically with what was, as well as what is driving the radical shifts. At the same time that so many names have been proffered is testament to the shared, albeit differentiated sense that there is something extreme and unsettling about this world. Of all the names that I have heard, the one I find most evocative is the Eremocene. Eremocene, the age of loneliness. Eremo is derived from the Greek eremos, meaning an isolated place, also the root of hermit. A hermit is a person who dwells apart. This slide I'm showing here is from an artwork of an exhibition called Eremocene by the Australian artist Keith Wilson. I find it beautifully evocative. When the myrmecologist E.O. Wilson coined the term, he was imagining a future age in which humans would be alone, not from other humans, but isolated on Earth as the lone remaining species. Life on the planet would, he wrote, be reduced to, quote, our domesticated plants and animals and our croplands all around the world as far as the eye can see, end of quote. In the Eremocene, humans are alone and lonely, not merely because extractive forms of human life have eradicated others as a physical presence, but because their beauty, their complexity, their songs, their stories, and critically their difference from us humans have been extinguished. For E.O. Wilson, the Eremocene represented a dystopian future, though given the rapacity of extractive forms of life, not an unlikely one. But the term does more than mask the unnerving facts. It resonates because it evokes something fundamental and devastating about the existential, epistemic, affective, and ethical character of this age. The conviction that humans exist on a unique place, high and remote above Earth others, that only humans are capable of complex communication, of multidimensional emotions, of sense-making, of storytelling, that man, as Kant insisted, is the only creature capable of interrupting reason and imagination, of interrupting instinct with reason and imagination, of transforming bodily desire into love and a sense of beauty. Only man anticipates the future, and most importantly, only man is capable of conceiving himself as the true end of nature. And with this, the only one capable of conceiving of all others, and again I quote from Kant, as means and tools for achieving his own chosen ends. And thus Kant tells us, man is correct to say to the sheep, the pelt that you bear was given to you by nature, not for yourself, but for me. And then from this form of ideological exceptionalism, combined with the forms of life that keep it in existence, flows the erosion of our capacity to relate, and indeed the cognitive and perceptual abilities that would enable us to attend to Earth others. I remember once speaking with Rob, our farrier, whose violent childhood took him out of formal schooling at the age of 14. I was puzzling about why one of the donkeys was keeping his distance from the others, and Rob pointed out to me that Zaki, one of the others, was very quickly lifting his lip and showing his teeth. When I said that I had missed that, Rob pointed out that we can perceive so much more than we generally do. Most of us have just lost the habit of paying attention. So it's a vicious and self-reinforcing circle. We decided there was nothing worth attending to, so we stopped paying attention, and then having stopped paying attention, we concluded there was nothing worth attending to. And of course, all of this supported by what Jose Medina called willful ignorance, the need not to know. And here we find ourselves in splendid isolation of convinced superiority, the Eremocene. That is what I meant when I said that the character of the age is the situation in which the business of knowing occurs. Yet this need not and must not be the finale of the story, and in this we have a part, and the we I'm talking about is the we here. Our ethical obligation as scholars animated by the drive to understand and prevent violence, injustice and broken relationships is to know, think and research in ways that might break with the qualities of the age that produce them. Indeed, precisely because the erasure of other animals as ethical beings is so intrinsic to the constitution of the form of life that produces and is reproduced by the Eremocene, crafting a path out of the Eremocene has to be at the heart of the practice of animal studies scholars. And I've been really inspired listening so far and reading the abstracts of the papers that I've either not attended or are coming to see how many of us are doing this. So I'm speaking very much in the heart of what I see happening in the movement, hopefully theorising it and giving it a bit more voice. So the core of my argument today is that the dominant modes of research that we have inherited and to which the political economy of the modern academy binds us are part and parcel of the separatist forms of life that constitute the Eremocene and hence incapable of transforming it. We are, in other words, in this political economy that we're interpolated into, built into Eremocenic research practices. So our ethical and methodological challenge has to be to craft non-Eremocenic research practices. In the remainder of this talk, I'm going to focus on what I see as two of the most damning research frames that I think keep the Eremocene in existence, and in each case, I'm going to offer an alternative conveyed through a story. The first is the standard view that humans are researchers and other animals are the researched, albeit ones that we hold with respect and that we treasure. As an alternative, I offer collaborative research practices with other animals as paths for disrupting the unjust and lonely distribution of capabilities that traditional research organises. The second form of Eremocenic scholarship lies in the assumption that the most robust forms of knowledge derive their claims from an abstracted analysis across multiple cases. By way of rebuttal, I offer a passionate defence of singularity. And this finally will take me back to the question of stories about particular animals and what is perhaps the most difficult argument that I want to make. And here I'm going to ask something of you because I am going to use the word God as Spinoza uses it, and I know that many of us carry a great deal of baggage from our own backgrounds about God as a transcendent being who carries a whole lot of forms of domination. So I would just ask you to bracket those preconceptions when I use that language. Following Spinoza, I want to suggest that the truest form of knowledge, which he called intuition, comes neither from perception, where our ideas are shaped through cultures of association, nor do we attain this knowledge through reasoned abstraction. Rather, the truest knowledge becomes possible when we can be present to the singular being, such that we can behold the infinitely variegated oneness of what Spinoza called God or nature, interchangeably. Here we find the unending company and ethics. This slide is for Dinesh in particular, knowing how much he loves God. That's Gandhi. Even before we get to the question of researching other animals or with other animals, classical, social and natural science methodologies deploy a firm hand to distribute the researcher and the researched on either side of an unimpeachable divide. This distribution has, of course, been challenged when it comes to research with other humans, where a range of feminist, Indigenous and other critical scholars have pointed to the concealed epistemological stakes of this approach. And more than that, they have crafted alternative methodologies where the realities of collaborative meaning-making are not simply allowed to show their face, but positively celebrated. Also in the field of animal studies, and again amongst many people here, there are brave souls who have refused the intellectual theft involved in erasing our animal collaborators, and I see this especially in the arts and humanities, where such approaches can still take the cover of creativity to shield themselves from the damning charge of sentimentality. In the social sciences, though, we have a way to go in developing mutualistic or collaborative methodologies, in part because research remains so unashamedly linguistic, but also because admitting other animals into the club of researchers breaks a number of taboos. And with so much when it comes to disrupting modernist humanist forms that substitute themselves for the thing in itself, simply extending existing practices to other animals is not going to do the job. Indeed, when we are starting with imaginations that have been atrophied by the dominance of human exceptionalism and positivism, crafting genuine alternatives will often have to start by jumping in and trying things out. Not long after Katie and Jimmy arrived, I started to take my reading down to where they lived. I'd lay out a blanket and Jimmy and Katie would pick it up and toss it around for a while. Once they had found out whatever it was that they wanted to discover, or when they tired of the search, I'd lay out flat-ish, sit down and start to read. Jimmy usually chatted to me for a while in his baritone voice, but then would settle a little further down in his world. But Katie would lie next to me and run her nose over my papers so they would end up terribly dirty. Sometimes, if she was resting, I'd lay my head on her side as a pillow and read. Occasionally, she started at a sound or something in the distance, throwing me and my papers into the dirt around us. When Katie died, our practice stayed with me. Although once Penny arrived, reading was a somewhat different matter. The image here is peaceful, but at a certain point, Penny would extract the book from my hands and throw it into the bush. Once Elle and I went down to read with her and Badger, who was another pig, and she made it perfectly clear that Badger was not welcome in the reading zone. And to reiterate her views, she tore the New York Review out of Elle's hands and distributed it around the run. Over the last decade, I've kept up reading with the pigs, not only because it's fun, but also because I started to notice that it was changing the nature of my research. So one of the questions I'd ask when I was out there with them was, what is it that we are doing and how is this different? My first thought was that by reading and thinking here with them in their world, we were challenging the very idea that thinking is correctly understood as a disembodied adventure of ideas. And with this, challenging the thought that the journey of disembodied ideas can drive change in the world. In other words, by embedding reading in this embodied human-pig relationship, we were pressing up against the persistent idealism which insists that the materialities of practice follow the work of reconceptualisation and the articulation of ideal principles for living. The question of whether shifts at the register of ideas are sufficient to bring about shifts in practice has long been subject to debate. It's a version of the mind-body problem that Descartes tried to solve with the pineal gland, which was supposed to join the mind and body. Taking a very different route, Baruch Spinoza writing in the 17th century, developed a complex ontology in which the whole question of a causal relationship between ideas and materiality, or what he called thought and extension, makes no sense at all. It makes no sense because thought and extension are two planes of reality, not two planes of reality vying for first place in a causal order, but two dimensions of a single substance, which he called God or nature. To be clear, Spinoza wasn't arguing against the importance of thinking. Indeed, he argued that a clear understanding of how causality actually works is critical to an ethical life. But thinking and extension, or embodiment, are always conjoined. As such, it is the forms of our lives, the types of associations in which we are involved, along with the ideas that we have about them, that are the most powerful vectors in shaping our actions and understanding alike. Responding in situ in the presence of others with interests and orientations that press against us turns out to be less a matter of applying principles than of trying things out, accommodating each other, rearranging our bodies. If justice has traditionally been understood in the seminar room as the realisation of an ideal set of arrangements that might be discovered in the form of correct principles, then justice here was more in the nature of what, following Walter Benjamin, we might call weak justice. We approach weak justice, or weak knowledge, by tracking the faint traces discerned through a subtle attentiveness. Now, today we're in the fortunate position where attentiveness has come to be one of the mainstays of animal studies scholarship or multi-species ethics. And yet I still think that we need to find out how, as humans, and I'm speaking here about humans who are constituted in dominant cultures, embodied histories provide limited apertures to how Earth others actually experience the world. How do we acquire the abilities to attend to them, to receive them, and relate to them otherwise? This experiment in research suggested a radical transformation of how we know with others can't be effected through the acquisition of intellectual or abstract knowledge. It can only be wrought through embodied ethopoetic practices. Now, a number of scholars give us really great material to think with here. Haraway's Making Kin, Gruen's Entangled Empathy, Crary and Gruen's Animal Crisis. But the one that I found particularly helpful is Isabel Stenger's notion of problematization. As Stengers explains, it is the work of problematization that requires that we enter into experimental practices in which we cannot remain safely on the outside, observing former limits and testing them as if they were rats in a maze. Rather, the problematic situation is one that takes hold of us, so that if successful, it becomes impossible to think or live as one formerly did. Indeed, drawing on Whitehead to emphasise the immediacy of this transformation, Stengers characterises the problematic situation as the opportunity for sheer disclosure. And I quote, emphatically, not the revelation of some truth behind the appearances, but rather a transformation of the relation entertained with what we know. To be capable of doing this type of work, the problematic situation has to have a high degree of at-stakeness. Stengers captures this in the phrase, "it matters." We must, she suggests, become prey to the situation. Only what touches us with that questioning force can do more than simply modify the application of existing reasons, but as Stengers puts it, actually alter the way you relate to your own reasons. Responding to the cry, she argues, means giving in to the power to problematise what we ask our reasons to do and what they do for us, how they matter for us, and how they make things matter. To be clear, I'm not suggesting that reading with animals should become standard methodology, and there's a range of experiments that are happening in this room and more broadly in the animal studies movement. What I wanted to do was to share how my unarticulated sense when I took that blanket and my books down to read with Jimmy and Katie, I had this sense that I needed to do something where the at-stakeness was visceral. That was what had me start reading with Katie, and it certainly has felt like an adventure in embodied ideas. A few weeks ago, Dinesh and I were in a supervision session with one of our brilliant doctoral students, and following standard social science doctrines about how to produce robust results, they were trying to abstract out the common themes across the data. Being the wise and disruptive person he is, Dinesh suggested that rather than looking for what was common, reducing the multiplicity to the lowest common denominator, they focused on what struck them. Put otherwise, that they tarry with and behold singularity. When we arrived on the land for the first time, 2 horses, one chestnut and one black, were grazing in the orchard, still displaying the final remnants of the apple and almond blossoms. When we bought the land, the former owners asked if these 2, Stead and Wookie, could stay, and so we joined them to live on their home. We didn't learn a great deal about Wookie except that he was around 24, that he had serious eye problems, and that the large indent on his back right hip was an injury sustained when he'd been used as a polo pony. In the ensuing years, Wookie's eyes continued to ulcerate, and he started to gradually lose his eyesight until he became totally blind. But neither his lack of sight nor his impaired legs represented problems as far as he was concerned. Even when 3 other horses joined him instead, he remained the absolute boss. So long as he was not taken away from his home, his embodied knowledge of the land's contours and his relationships with his friends enabled him to move around freely. Now, many of you will know that it's rare for a large horse to live past around 28, so the last 6 years have felt like an absolute blessing. As I started to face ageing myself, I came to realise that Wookie was my greatest teacher. With absolutely no loss of dignity, he clearly told us what he needed. Now for me to lead him past the chicken house so he didn't trip on their bowls. Now for me to say up as he walked into the front of his stable so his hoof didn't catch on the front. Now for one of his friends to stand close enough to touch as they walked past fallen trees. Sometimes it would take my breath away when I saw him canter up one of the steep slopes or navigate his way to the stable wall, walking along its head until he found the entrance to his own stable. Never did he interpret the realities of his physical vulnerability as humiliation or even really loss, the ultimate zen. We lived these last years anticipating his death, hoping he wouldn't fall on one of the steep slopes during the night, break his hip, and have to wait till morning for us to find him. We bought a gun in case. Then just 3 weeks ago, early one morning when I was in Sydney at work, the phone rang and it was Elle. Wookie was in a very bad way. He was confused and he couldn't put any weight on his back leg. When I arrived, I found him lying on the grass in the corral, a bucket and a sponge nearby. I sat with him and felt the disappearance of his life. He tried in vain to get up. I called in the other horses so they could spend the remaining hours with him, and I went inside to get a hat and some water. When I returned, he was standing but unable to walk. I managed to inch him into the shade for the next few hours. Eventually, as the light was falling, I asked him if he wanted to live through the night or to die this evening. He answered by walking in tight circles till he finally fell, where we could help him die. The clarity of his, and that he's not dead there, just so you know, he's alive. the clarity of his answer completely in keeping with the clarity of his life. The extraordinary nature of Wookie's singularity speaks for itself, how he broke through any preconceptions about the distribution of wisdom, the myriad lessons he taught anyone who was available to learn about acceptance, about asking, about grace, about the real meaning of strength, about aging, and about dying. Beyond the particular content of those lessons, though, he also taught me about the infinity of singularity. For Spinoza, one of the habitual mistakes that we tend to make is assessing the singular being against some imagined norm or model, such that the singular being either fails or excels vis-a-vis that model. Each being, Spinoza insisted, was absolutely as they ought to be, not with respect to some external normative standard, but because they are constituted as they are within an infinitely complex set of interactions that give every being its form and way of being. To admonish a being for being as it is, Spinoza thought, is like scolding a stone for falling along the arc of gravity when it is tossed through the sky. I'm going to read this quote, which I found while I was writing about Wookie, and I just find quite remarkable. It's from a letter that Spinoza wrote. We say, for example, that a blind man is deprived of sight because we easily imagine him as seeing, whether this imagine arises from the fact that we compare him with others who see, or we compare his present state to his past, when he used to see. When we consider the man in this way, by comparing his nature with that of others, or with his own past nature, then we affirm that seeing pertains to his nature, and for that reason we say that he is deprived of it. But when we consider God's decree and his nature, we can no more affirm of that man than of a stone that he is deprived of vision. For at that time, vision no more pertains to the man without contradiction than it does to the stone, since nothing more pertains to the man and is his than what the divine intellect and will attribute to him. Importantly, recognising the perfection of each being as it is does not mean that we can't pass judgment about, for example, the abuse of power or exploitation. Indeed, insofar as we are always affected by other beings, passing judgment about what we find good and what we find bad is part of our nature. But a true understanding of the ethical import of such judgments needs to be directed to the larger dynamics within which beings are formed and not at the being themselves. But Spinoza also wanted to say something much more momentous that followed from this type of knowledge of the perfection of each being. Spinoza suggested that there are three types of knowledge. The first he called imagination, whereby I know through my sense perceptions, my habits and the interpretive patterns, and when I know through the imagination, I experience myself and others as distinct. The second type of knowledge he called intellect. Here I compare my own experience with those of others, as well as comparing events and circumstances to establish abstract knowledge, or shared structures and regularities. Taken to its most developed level, this second type of knowledge, abstract knowledge or intellect, can lead us to conclude that common to all beings is the fact that they are part of a single substance, again, which Spinoza called God or nature. The third type of knowledge, Spinoza called intuition, and this is the one that his interpreters have found most difficult to understand. In intuition, Spinoza seems to be saying, I experience a singular thing as being one way that God or nature exists. But unlike in the second type of knowledge, this knowledge of the unity of the singular eternal is not mediated through abstract knowledge. It is, to return to Stenger's, sheer disclosure. To know the singular being this way is to know it intuitively as simply being a way in which God or nature eternally exists. As Claire Carlyle put it, intuition has an immediacy that makes it kind of timeless. It gives us an experience of eternity, which brings deep rest and peace. Each being is, in its sheer uniqueness, a modification of the infinite attributes of this single substance, again, which Spinoza called God or nature. Now, to be clear, this is something, and I'm happy to talk about it in question time, but to be clear, this notion of God or nature for Spinoza is something very different from God standing outside nature and creating it. This is an immanent notion of ongoing creativity. It's transcendence within immanence. To come back, and so each rather is a modification of the infinite unity. And so to intuit the singular is to know God or nature simultaneously in its unity and in its myriad modifications. In intuition, we get that through the encounter with the singular being. To come back to the stories that I've shared, accepting Jimmy's and Wookie's preference to die on their own terms is accepting the way things are. And in this, to love Jimmy or Wookie is to love God or nature. But this is not an ordinary love, it's a love based on recognising their ultimate embeddedness in eternity, God or nature. But there is still more. As knowers, we are also, of course, modifications of the attributes of God or nature, and as such, in recognising the unity of being in the singularity of other beings, God or nature is recognising itself, the ultimate anecdote and the ultimate antidote to the Eremocene. I think that Jimmy and Wookie were both Spinozists. So I'm going to moderate questions, so please just come to the mic. Thanks, Sue.
Thank you, Danny. As always, your storytelling goes as deep as it ever needs to go. I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about imagination and intuition. Yeah.
So, imagination is the term that Spinoza uses, but it's a little bit confusing for us because he doesn't mean imagination in the sense that we mean of a kind of speculative imagination of the possible, although he does also write about that. By imagination, he means, so as I intimated, for Spinoza, ideas are the ideas of the body. He's not a dualist. So imagination is the knowledge that we take in through our bodies, through our perceptions. But our perceptions are never pure perceptions. They're always formed through our associations. So that means that when we're constituted in cultures that hold other animals in a particular way, when I have the knowledge of a sheep, for example, through this first type of a knowledge of imagination, I already perceive it as a particular type of being. So in that way, meaning is kind of built into perception. He understands that. He's like a hermeneutic phenomenologist, for those of you who are familiar with that term. In other words, phenomenology, how we experience the world, is mediated through meaning. So a very complex term for that. And then abstracto or ratio or intellect, the second type, is where we kind of abstract, where we come to reason, to generalities. Sometimes it talks about common principles or common attributes. Intuition, and I do not pose myself as having the ultimate understanding of intuition because there's a huge amount of disagreement about what he means by it. But sometimes he talks about that when you look at, for those of us who can do it, that when you look at a mathematical problem, you can sometimes immediately see the answer, but then you have to go back and actually work out how you would prove that. sometimes great physicists talk about actually seeing the answer and then having to go back and prove it. So in intuition, and the part of intuition that I wanted to bring out is because he has this complex ontology where he's a monist, so there's one substance, which he calls God or nature, with an infinite number of attributes. We have access to two of them, ideas and extension, but he thinks that there's an infinite number of them. And each being is what he calls a mode or a modification of those attributes. So in intuition, when I encounter the singular other, I simultaneously encounter them as their singularity, as they are, Sue or Wookie, and I also encounter them as a modification of the infinite attributes. So it's in the sheer disclosure that both the singularity, this is what I find so powerful about it, it's not a type of monism that dissolves difference. Monism only exists in its infinite modifications. And that's what you have through this third type of knowledge, as I understand it.
So you talked a lot about the domestic animals that you had the connection with in this presentation. Is there any connections you've had with wild animals on your property that you've had an exchange with as well? And could you talk about that?
Absolutely. So, of course, the relationships with the domesticated animals, who I hope are increasingly becoming undomesticated as they get to live there, is very different to the relationship that we have with the wild animals. But I'm actually going to come at that question slightly differently to start with, which is the privilege that I have had to witness the relationships between the wild animals and the domesticated animals. So, and then I'll come to our relationship with them with two brief stories. We have, since the Black Summer fires, have so many people on the East Coast experienced absolutely extraordinary rains. So in 2023, we had 1 metre of rain in a 3-day period, just huge floods, which of course have massive impacts for a lot of the wild animals, most gravely for the wombats whose homes are flooded. During those wet periods, one of the wombats moved in with the donkeys in the donkey house, one of them moved in with the horses, and one of them slept on the dog beds on our veranda. I mentioned this to Felicity yesterday. I think the high point for me of feeling that we had acted in right relationship with those around us was one morning in a particularly violent storm. We have a glass front door. One of the wombats came and knocked on the front door with her baby and brought her to the house. So this is very much about a way of being rather than conscious interventions, although we do treat their mange. I hope that the way that we have been has conveyed reciprocity and sharing of space. This is a hard story I'm going to share, but this was absolutely remarkable. The afternoon that Wookie was dying, I went over to give the donkeys their dinner. They're kind of on the other side of the house. And there was a wallaby right next to the house. The wallabies never come right next to the house. And as I approached, I saw that he was covered in flies and that he was dying. And so literally like 35 minutes before Wookie died, he came and died right outside the house. So that type of kind of emergence of intimacy, which has been their impulse rather than ours, I take as an index of some type of learning that we're going through about how to be on this land in a way that doesn't have us occur as a kind of violent intervention, but has us occur as co-inhabitants who also offer some type of care. Oh, Dinesh, thank you.
So I picked Danny up from the airport on Tuesday afternoon, and Danny said, I'm not sure how the paper will go down because I mentioned God. I'm really interested, because I'm really interested in this space, because I do think lots of scholars in our community actually engage with spiritual practice and spiritual systems in a way that's different from other fields. And so I'm just curious about your reflections on that. And is this also a space that we need to move through, or your views on that?
So I think you're right. In general, I think the theoretical and methodological scope of animal studies scholars is particularly broad, and people are willing to engage in quite risque and experimental theories and methodologies and conceptual frames. I do think that the word God carries a huge amount of problematic baggage, which makes us resistant to using it. Part of my project, apart from the fact that I think Spinoza is just a really extraordinary scholar, is part of the reason that I quite consciously draw on him, as opposed to, I think there are a range of ontologies or ways of sense-making that can do similar work, is I think it's really problematic to hypostatise Western philosophy as monotone. I think it's really important that we see the way in which there are breaks and ruptures within Western traditions as well. I think it's very disempowering not to see that. And it also leads to the problematic situation where scholars like me are either in danger of appropriating Indigenous or other knowledges, or kind of being left dumb in our own traditions. So I think that given that most of us intuit that where we need to move intellectually, and I'm using intellectually in an embodied way, is very radical, that we can't just tweak the edges of dominant knowledge practices. I think moving into some of the resources that traditions that go under the name of spirituality or theology. I was like a die-hard secularist. And then I started to read some really amazing theology. And it just blew my mind, because we have this idea that somehow theologians have this, like one of my favourite teachers said, the God that you don't believe in, I don't believe in either. And so I think there are resources for thinking about the nature of being that take us past or allow us to come into some of the questions that we ask in a different way. And as scholars, I'm sure all of you and artists have had this experience that problems become insoluble because of the way that we ask questions. So, for example, the tension between the mind and body, or the tension between the collective and the individual. Those seem to be insoluble problems because of the way that we ask the question. And I think that there are spiritual and theological traditions that help us ask those questions in a different way, that might help us get past some of the kind of sticking points that we find ourselves as scholars who are really trying to think at this, to rupture some of the ontological assumptions that keep violence in place.
Just to carry on with the kind of talk about God, and I don't think it's why everyone's so stunned. I think we're just all so moved, and at the same time, the complexity of your thought and your parsing of Spinoza's thought is kind of mind-blowing, and I don't think I've got it, but I'd love to get it. And so there was just one little phrase that you used, which was the transcendence within immanence, that I was just trying to imagine what does that look like?
Oh boy, I so wish I could answer that. Like, I just spend... that's one of those questions that I think gets us into knots. And that's why I think Spinoza answers it with intuition. I could give you a bunch of words to answer it. That one way of answering it would be to say that the standard understanding we have of transcendence is that the transcendent, whether it's mind, body, spirit, God, whatever, is that which brings about change in that which is changed. That's kind of classic dualist understanding of transcendence. Whereas most materialist monism, particularly kind of post-Francis Bacon, the kind of positivist empiricism that got developed with modernity, just ejects the transcendent altogether and sees nature as a machine. Whereas the kind of transcendent immanence keeps in this infinite possibility and creativity and non-determinism, but not as an outside force within nature itself. So I can kind of try and wrap words around it, but ultimately that's why I told stories, because honestly, it's in my encounter where, and I'm sure that you've all had this, where you have encountered another being, where you have had that sense of encountering everything. That's where I think you get it.
Yeah, just a quick comment and a question. Thank you for your talk, amazing, and I love that you brought metaphysical assumptions, because to be a real game changer, I think that the ordinary lived experience, it has assumptions. It's already loaded with metaphysical assumptions, but we don't pay attention to them. So coming to read theologians or philosophers that are trying to become aware of these assumptions is really helpful. And yeah, I like that you were very careful about like universalism and the critical theory that talks about it can be a kind of domination, but yeah, we can navigate like sensitively in this era, in this sphere. I'd like to know your comment or your sense about the direction you suggested and about embodied knowledge and researching with animals. So, I mean, part of it may be because I'm a young scholar and I will need a job, but like the point is the current affairs of society. When we see arts or sports that are very popular, and these are kind of embodied knowledges sometimes, arts and sports. But I think many times they fall into satisfying their public audience in a capitalist society. So I think most of us, I don't know, but I'm cautious about using it, but we are careful not falling into that as academics, not falling into satisfying what the public wants, and still be in the embodied knowledge and expression. And the current state of things is that governments funds universities, and for mostly for specific reasons or for specific research aims. And it seems to me that going into direction with researching with animals and embodied knowledge is not what most governments find profitable for themselves. And I love to go to that direction. It's the right way, it's in my opinion. But the challenge is that I think we lose relevance to government and their funding opportunities. And at the same time, the area of sports and arts, it's mostly capitalist logic, but I'm really actually hopeful in the sense that we find a way to navigate and like our place in society in broader kind of affairs. But I'd like to know about your what you sense and what you think is happening and the direction and in that sense of
Thank you. I mean, there's a huge amount in the way that you narrated what I would call the kind of political economy of knowledge. And so I can only respond to a part of it. Absolutely no doubt that dominant funding practices are going to support not only particular methodologies, but methodologies that are in support of particular outcomes that are consistent with the exploitation of other animals. And part of the reason that I know that not everybody lives with pigs and so I can't do what I do, but part of the reason that I use that example is because it's such a simple practice. I don't need funding to read with, I didn't need it to read with Katie, I didn't need it to read with Penny. And so I think part of the art of the present is finding micro movements of resistance. And I also think a lot about this in terms of privilege. And what I mean by that is I am a fully tenured senior scholar. I can take a lot more risks than someone who is in a precarious position. And I appreciate that precarious early career researchers also need to stabilise their own bodies in ways that enable them to do research. And so I think the movements that I can make and the movements that people in different positions can make are going to be different. So I absolutely want to be clear about that everybody needs to be safe and needs to be able to support themselves and the people in their world. At the same time, and this is why I talked about the Eremocene and why I invoked the notion of omnicide, everybody here knows what's at stake. And there is a way in which the somnambulance of the academy seduces us into keep on thinking that we can just do a variation of the same. My university has made a 10-year plan that doesn't mention climate change. All of us are asked to do 3 5-year plans. Do you know what I put in my 5-year plan? Navigating the fire and the pandemic. So I think that simultaneously we need to take care of ourselves and each other and the material circumstances of our own lives, but also stand for what's at stake and refuse, and I know that all of you do this in your own ways, we all do this, but actually refuse to be interpolated into the somnambulance of business as usual, because then to some extent we also become complicit in it. And again, I want to be really careful. These are personal ethical choices that we make in our own lives, depending on where we're coming from, who we have to support, what the ground beneath our feet is. So for me, it's more a kind of invitation of where are the micro movements of resistance to these research practices and forms of knowledge acquisition that are just completely inappropriate for the world that we're actually facing. And yet we continue to incentivise to use them because that's how we get grants, that's how we get publications. And yet, often when I'm facing these same types of questions about how am I going to be seen, am I going to get published, what I do is I bring to mind something like Katie getting burnt to death in the fire. What I bring to mind is I try and do what Stengers was saying, which is bring myself into the problematization of what's actually at stake. And that, at least for me, and I'm really speaking personally, that gives me the courage that that's what I'm allied with, not that. Thank you.